Hello everyone, glad you could make it. Today, we'll be taking a look at Witch from Mercury's third Gundam so far, that being the Gundam Pharact. It's a pretty interesting design, being quite a departure from Vanadis' Lubris and Shinsei's Ariel. The kit is also an interesting one as well, with lots of articulation points in places you might not expect just from looking at the design. Personally, I have a love-hate relationship with this kit, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Anyways, let's get to work. This kit has some great box art, one of my favorites. I'm really loving those reds and purples. Inside are quite a few runners, 6 in total, as well as a small sticker sheet. While on the topic of stickers, there isn't a metallic sticker for the shell unit on the forehead, which I think is a missed opportunity, but that part is actually molded in red plastic. The actual plastic isn't as soft as on other kits in this range, notably the other Gundams, at least for the exterior bits. Construction on this kit took a while, especially compared to Choo-Choo's Demi Trainer, which I built right before this one. While building the kit, quite a lot jumped out at me, which can't be said about other kits in the lineup, both good and bad. I'll start by getting the cons out of the way. This kit is one of the least stable in the lineup. The proportions of the design, coupled with how parts intensive the backpack is, makes this kit want to fall over when standing. The Pharact looks much better in a flight pose anyways. The backpack is also a point of interest. This kit has a frame, including the backpack, which is on the more fragile end. I actually broke a piece in half, my first broken piece in this hobby. The way the outer armor attaches to the frame also could result in some snapping, since the connection points are small pegs, which on most of the parts only exist on one side. On my kit, these parts wouldn't fit flush without some effort, which made me think I was going to snap more parts off. You also only get 4 gun bits, which is less than the amount seen in the anime, so if you want to recreate scenes from the anime as faithfully as possible, you'll need to buy another kit just for the gun bits. It is worth noting that this is on the more expensive end as far as these Witch from Mercury kits go. But there are positives. Articulation is fantastic, especially on the feet. Both parts of the feet can independently articulate, which is so unnecessary, but I love it. I wish there was a double joint on the elbows, but that's a matter of the actual design itself. As tedious and fragile as the backpack is, it's a neat piece. The thrusters move in and out with some upwards and downwards articulation. The beam saber storage in the forearm is also just so cool. I know some people fault it for not being 100% accurate, but it doesn't bother me. The kit also has an open hand part, which is something I will always bring up with the Witch from Mercury kits. Not even the Ariel has an open hand part, something else I will bring up more than I probably need to. Overall, this kit is an interesting one. Although it has some great features, build-wise it is on the lower end. Not because it was hard, but because there's a lot of potential for it to go wrong. I do think the Pharact would make for a better kit in 1/100 scale. It's also worth noting that it isn't a bad kit, I'm just speaking based off my own experience with it. You might build the kit yourself and not run into any of the issues I had, but let's get to painting. I primed the model with Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 and sprayed a coat of Tamiya TS17 Gloss Aluminum. This took a while. Not only are there lots of surfaces to cover, I went through my only can of TS17 and had to buy some more. Even someone like me runs into problems this simple, which just added to me not wanting to paint the kit. But I chose TS17 as the undercoat because within the Witch from Mercury universe, pile suits are more aerodynamic than the competition. For a suit this large, this means light and aluminum fits. As usual, I start off painting the most tedious parts with the piston details on the frame and the thrusters. I will be using Basalt Gray quite a bit in this build, which does technically violate the concept I set, where each company's suits have a set color palette. This color was used on the Delanzas, which are a Turk suit. However, it's just a great color, which goes with literally everything. I have tried to keep usage at a minimum for these Witch from Mercury builds, but if you've seen any of my other build videos, it's a familiar. The main color on the Pharact is a very pale gray, which brings up the concept I have for this build. When I first bought the Pharact, I wanted to paint it black to heavily contrast the look on my Ariel. it would also work since the Pharact is a more menacing design. But I felt the black was too on the nose and too similar to the original colors. In this build series, the Delanzes and the Darabald look almost identical to the original colors, and I didn't want this to be the case for yet another video. I'm choosing a pale gray to deliberately mimic the color scheme on the Ariel. I view the Pharact as a sort of imitation Gundam, and want the overall color scheme to be a slightly more subdued version of the Ariels. It's sort of like how in nature, certain animals evolve to mimic other ones to avoid predators. This gray is one I really like. For a color this light, I had no problems whatsoever, and it went on super smooth. After only 3 coats, the metallic undercoat was covered, but in some parts I paint on some more just so I wasn't wasting any paint. I did mix up a little more than I usually do. That 6:1 ratio isn't one I normally use. I was honestly guessing and was prepared to tweak it a bit, but it turned out well, which was a nice surprise. Although I have to paint some more sections after this color, it's already coming together. Lighter tones look great on the Pharact, and after I painted on this color, I was starting to warm up to the design. I also think this light gray could work on the mass production Eva series, but I only came to this realization because I was watching End of Evangelion while painting. In the Darabald video, I talked about how I need to break in my paintbrushes since I'm not a fan of how they work when new. But after that build, the new brushes I bought are pretty much perfect for the way I work. There isn't as much adhesive holding the brush together, which allows it to have better coverage, but since it is newer, there's still a pointed tip, which allows me to be pretty precise. I just need to remember to put my brushes on a rotation, so there isn't any premature wear. Although I decided early on that black was too on the nose for this design, I still want to incorporate some into the final paint scheme. As usual, I'm using German gray as a substitute for black. It gives the impression of black while being easier to paint. Here's what I mean by that. When painting, you can tell if your paint is dry and ready for another coat if it isn't glossy. But some black paints are so deep, you can't really tell when they're dry. Normally, this isn't a problem if you wait things out, but if you're like me and have to finish your projects on a self-imposed deadline for internet content, you can rush things and accidentally paint on another layer too soon because it is a little harder to tell. But I also think a dark gray simply looks better because the contrast isn't as stark as with the black. It's also a paint I can actually find, since black and white always sell out first whenever my local shop does a Vallejo restock. Using the German gray in these limited areas was an idea I had from the very beginning, and I'm glad it turned out the way I wanted. Because it's so dark, you get some much needed contrast, but since the areas of gray are relatively restricted, it doesn't overpower things. It's quite nice if I do say so myself. I wanted a small pop of color. The areas on the backpack with the movable thrusters is perfect, since it isn't the most visible. German orange is a color I don't use that much, since it isn't as vibrant as I normally want, but here it works. This tiny spot of orange is probably my favorite part of the entire paint job. I'm just using Basalt Gray again. I did think of mixing another color, incorporating some purple, but I decided to keep things subtle and not go overboard with colors. While it is rewarding to use a bunch of different colors and see how they all work together, I wanted this color scheme to be a bit more tasteful. Just like on the Ariel, which this color scheme mimics, the only real spots of color should come from the shell units. Even that orange, which you just saw me paint, is kept super minimal. Those two small areas are the only places you'll see them. I sprayed a coat of Mr. Super Clear Semi-Gloss, and now I'm adding decals. These are Bandai water slides from their new Witcher Mercury multi-use set. The quality on these is pretty good, with print quality comparable to the third-party options. I also feel like Bandai's decals are getting thinner too. The main issue with these is that there aren't enough for both the outer and inner surfaces. You only really get half of the optimal amount. So I did have to use 2 sets, which I already had. As for why I'm using the Bandai decals, it's because I don't own any third-party ones yet. I do know that both Delpy and G Rework recently came out with a set, but I don't want to delay this build any longer. The decals look pretty good, and the large yellow chevrons on top of the grays remind me of the Valkyries from Macross. The Bandai Hobby website does include a marking guide, but it isn't the best since the decals aren't numbered. This really is a nitpick, but one I think is pretty important, especially for people who may not have used water slides before or don't have that much experience with them. Even I got confused since the decal layout is optimized for saving space on the decal sheet instead of for user experience. Bandai's water slides have a tendency to come loose, so I'll let them dry longer than usual for about 6 hours. Now I can focus on my favorite weathering step, chipping. I start off with generic chipped effects over the model just to set things up and create an effect that'll help blend the other chipping effects I'll be doing. And this is done by using metal tweezers, using their natural spring to bounce them all over the kit and remove paint. This reveals the metallic undercoat with super fine chips that can't be replicated with a brush. It's a technique you may need to get used to, but the result is worth it for a relatively small amount of work. I also wanted some edge wear, which I'm achieving with my hobby knife, lightly scraping at the edges to reveal the metallic undercoat as well. Whenever I do edge wear, I make sure to never scrape along the entire edge, instead going for bits and pieces. I also make sure that the edge wear isn't symmetrical. This is important both for realism and for visual interest. I'm also introducing some chipping on the larger decals. I'll just scrape at them until I have a result I like. By scraping at the decals, it creates chipped effects, as well as removing all of the excess carrier film, which is thicker than other third-party ones I'm used to. Physical chipping in general is a technique I really enjoy, but it is one that you can only really appreciate in person. Since the effect is so fine, it doesn't show up that well on camera, but the effect has a dimensionality to it that you just don't get with painting on your chips. After all, what's a more realistic chipping effect than actual chipping? It's time for a pin wash. This is where the model will really come to life, as a pin wash highlights all of the kit details and adds a sense of dimensionality to the model. It's great stuff, even though it is one of the more tedious parts of weathering. A lot of people like to use panel liner, the most popular probably being Tamiya. But I prefer the wash, since it's water soluble, so there's no need for me to buy any extra thinner. I have also heard that Tamiya panel liner can crack plastic, which means it'll probably do the same to paint, and I don't want to have that risk. Even though panel liner may be easier to use, I'm used to the wash anyways. I like using a pre-made wash because it's at the perfect consistency, where it'll flow into the details and highlight them, but not flow out of them and sit on the surface of the paint, creating a messy appearance. Because of this, I am somewhat limited with color choice, but I haven't run into a build where I had to use a color other than black, brown, or gray for a pin wash. For an acrylic product, these washes dry pretty slowly and are quite blendable. If I made my own by simply thinning paint with water, it would dry in minutes. These washes take around an hour to dry, sometimes even longer. I let the wash dry for several hours, and now I'm adding a patina. Because of the light grays, I am using a lighter wash mixture. First, I'll speckle the wash mixture all over the kit, and then streak it downwards with a flat brush. The patina is a great way to quickly knock off the factory fresh look and immediately make a kit look weathered. In this small of a scale, I need weathering effects which are on the more subtle side, and the patina is perfect since I can adjust it to my preference. If I want a heavier effect, I'll remove less paint, and if I want it more subtle, I'll remove more. It's important to let the wash dry fully, since I'm moving around a bunch of wet paint with a damp brush. If the wash wasn't dry, I'd remove most, if not all of it, when removing the majority of the wash specks. After this dries, I'll spray a coat of Mr. Hobby Flat Top Coat to seal everything. The last part to paint are the inside of the shell units and the eyes. For both of these areas, I'm using a metallic red mixture with a small touch of fluorescent magenta. Compared to the aerial shell units, these aren't as vibrant, but that does fit the goal I had in mind. Now I can fit the clear pieces in place. I thought I was going to have some fit problems because of all the paint, and would have to scrape some of it off, which always makes me nervous, but I had no problems. These clear parts are a little lighter than I thought though, not an issue, but something I figured I'd point out. The Pharact has these large boosters on the wings, which seemed like the perfect place for some ancient soot. This is my first time really doing something like this, so my method may change, but what I do is put a bunch of this paint on the inside of a thruster and streak some of it downwards with a small brush to give the impression of these streaks happening because of movement. I'll then keep adding and removing this acrylic until I get an effect I want. The final part of the build to paint is the beam rifle, of course. I primed the finishing surfacer and sprayed some Tamiya TS100 semi-gloss bright gunmetal. I like the darker metallic, so I'm only painting the magazine, opting for Basalt Gray. I normally go for green gray on my weapons magazines, but I'm reserving that color for Jeturk suits. Instead of the pin wash, I'm doing a gunk wash. I start this off by painting a black wash all over the beam rifle and removing all the excess with a paper towel, which leaves the wash in all the details. It's a quicker process, and although it's not as precise as the pin wash, the slightly messier effect is perfect in my opinion for weapons. And if I feel some of the details could use a little more wash, I'll add some more. But with that, the kit is done. Here's how the Pharact looks in the bare plastic. And here's how it looks after a bit of work. I am very pleased with how this kit turned out. At first, I never really liked the Pharact design, especially after I broke some parts and ran out of metallic spray paint midway through the pre-painting stage, but these lighter colors suit it so well. This idea was one I came up with almost immediately after building the kit 2 months ago, so I'm glad it turned out exactly how I imagined. I know this video took a while to come out, but I hope you enjoyed and found the wait worth it. As usual, this isn't an explicit statement on how to paint your own Gunpla, but a look into my own process. If you liked what you see, feel free to use any of these colors or techniques. Next in the build series is the standard Demi Trainer. I know we kinda covered it earlier with Choo Choo's Demi Trainer, but it's a neat little kit and one I have no problems with covering again. Thank you so much for watching. Consider supporting the channel, it definitely helps me out, and I'll be seeing you in the next video, whenever that is.